B'hanchil Elyon Goyim. When God had given the world to those who defied him initially, we find that initially the Torah tells us they all had spoken one language and they had come together with the idea that they're going to rebel against God. And they would build a tower. This is the Tower of Babel. And they would go into the heavens and wage war with Hashem. What does God do? He disperses them by each one assuming another language. And this is the background on the 70 root nations. The 70 families that were there, each one assumed another language. And as a result of not being able to communicate, it says God confused their languages because each one assumed another language and they couldn't communicate, and therefore this disrupted the whole project. But it says that God dispersed them. A third of them were actually, the ocean came up and drowned them. A third of them were actually dispersed. And a third of them, this is an interesting midrash, he turned them into monkeys. You hear this? He turned them into monkeys. So when they find now, through archaeology, they find remains of the initial man, and they said, well, man comes from monkey. It's the other way. It was the human being who was turned into a monkey. That was the punishment. A third of the people of the Tower of Babel, they were turned into apes. Okay? Homo sapien, right? Howard, when he went to, in elementary school, he took Latin, Homo sapien. Okay. So it's the other way. So Rashi says, "K'shehindchel HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'machisov eschelek nachlosom hitzifon v'shotfom." He drowned them. Then it says, "V'afridu b'nei Odom." When he separated mankind, Rashi says, "What's v'afridu b'nei Odom? If hifetz dor haflogo hoya bedin l'havir min ha'olam." At the time of the Tower of Babel, he should have really destroyed them. V'lo asa kain, but he didn't destroy them. V'lo elo yatzak v'lo samim. He established the parameters of the nations, the boundaries of the nations. Kima v'lo yibdom. Why? Why didn't he destroy them? The Tower of Babel followed the Great Flood. Lemispar b'nei Yisrael. Now, Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Chom, and Yefes. Now, the Jewish people come from who? Avraham Avinu came from Shem. Shem was the tzaddik. If he would have destroyed all of them, Shem's descendant, who would have been Avraham Avinu, would have never come about. B'shvil mispar b'nei Yisrael, shasid mulotzis b'nei Shem. The reason why he didn't destroy them, although at that moment they deserved to be destroyed, because ultimately Klal Yisrael had to come from the descendants of Shem. And why are there 70 nations? To correspond to the 70 souls that went down to Egypt. The reason why there's 70 languages, each nation has its own unique profile, it corresponds to the Shivim Nefesh Yod Mitzrayim. The 70 souls when Yaakov went to Egypt, when he found out Yosef was alive, it says B'Shivim Nefesh Yordu Avzin Mitzrayim. So again, why did he not destroy them? Because the number of Bnei Yisrael who had to come from them, from the Bnei Shem, and why is the number 70 among the nations to correspond to the Shivim Nefesh that went down to Egypt? Okay, talk about this a little bit. The Torah tells us that what initially precipitated the rebellion against Hashem, because the Torah tells us, Sofa Achas, they spoke one language. And Rashi says, what language did they speak? Lashon HaKodesh. The original language of man was Lashon, the holy tongue. God created the world with Lashon HaKodesh, and that was the language of Adam, being the spiritual being that he was. That was his language, and his descendants, they all spoke Hebrew. There may have been dialects within Safa Achas, but it was basically Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, and as a result of them, so why were they able to actually create this unity to go against Hashem? Because they spoke the same language. That's what the Torah tells us. So what did God do? He gave each one, he confused them by giving each one their own language, and they weren't able to communicate. And Rashi over there explains, one asked for an axe, and the other one gave him something else. This caused a quarrel, and they began actually killing one another. And this disrupted the project, the rebellion against Hashem. So I asked the question, people don't speak the same language, and yet they're somehow able to communicate, although they don't understand the language itself. Through pantomime or through gestures, they're able to communicate, pointing to things. Why then? We're talking about they were phenomenally intelligent people. They could construct this tower to go against God. You mean say they couldn't communicate somehow with one another? But it said he confused them by giving each one their own language. And this is the origin of languages. So how do we understand simply? So I once mentioned a Maharal of Prague on the Gemara Megillah. The Gemara says over there, so cites a pasuk, that because Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor, destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, Hashem said the punishment will be that there will not be a descendant from Nebuchadnezzar. Vashti was the last living descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, and she was killed at the party because she spoke disrespectfully to Achashverosh, her husband. He gave the order she should be killed. That was the end of the line of Nebuchadnezzar. And then it says, there's not going to be Sher Nin V'Nechet, quotes a pasuk. There will not be, the language is going to be forgotten. Even the Babylonian language will be forgotten. So Tosfos asks a question, but factually, even in the time of Tosfos, in Babylon, they still speak Aramaic. So what do you mean the language is going to be forgotten? So Tosfos answers that what it means that the royalty had a certain dialect. The dialect which the royalty spoke, that's going to be forgotten. So that means what represented the royal family, that's going to be totally forgotten, wiped out. Nobody will remember that. That's Tosfos' answer. The Maharal of Prague explains it differently, profoundly. The Maharal explains the Tosfos' question, what is language? Language is an expression of the culture. Every nation has its profile, and because of its profile, it has a certain temperament, and it has a certain creativity, a certain approach, and that culture is expressed through language. He says, what happens if you have a Persian, and the Persian speaks Babylonian? The Persian doesn't become a Babylonian because he speaks fluently, he speaks Persian. He's a Persian who speaks Babylonian, but a Babylonian his origin is Babylonian, the language expresses what he represents, the culture of Babylon. So when Hashem says the language will come to an end, the language will no longer represent that culture. Meaning that perspective, that temperament, that profile is gone. It will not exist any longer. So now the language, although it continues, it's like other nationalities happen to speak that language, know the language. That's how the Maharal of Prague answers Tosfos' question. So that's what it means. The language, we forgot the language will no longer represent what Babylon was. The culture will be extinct. There won't be any trace of that culture any longer in effect. Okay? So now, when Hashem dispersed them, and how did he disperse them? And how did he bring the project, the rebellion, to an end? Each one initially says Safa Achas. They all spoke one language, which was Lashon HaKodesh. By giving them different languages, there were 70, these were the 70 root nations. What happened when he gave them languages? It's not verbally, they didn't understand what the other one was saying. Each one had another perspective. Each one it was a different mindset, a different temperament. So what actually disrupted the project, the rebellion, was because they couldn't, there was no meeting of the minds. If we all come from the same background, we have a meeting of the minds. But if each of us have our own temperament, our own culture, our own personality, as a result of that, we can't come to a consensus. As a result of that, that's what disrupted the project. So that's what it means. One asked for one thing, somebody said something else. It's not because they didn't actually understand what the other one was saying. They disagreed in terms of the whole approach. Once there was that disagreement, they began fighting and quarreling and killing one another. That brought the project to a halt. That's with the morale. That's the way I want to understand, explain. That's the story with the 70 nations when it says he confused their languages. The confusion was because now each of them sees things differently. It's like, the Frenchman and the Englishman. No, they can't come to terms. They see things differently. Or many other nationalities. It's a different mindset. It's the fabric of the personality of that nationality, the pedigree of that nation. That's what it is. So what I said was, initially before they rebelled against the Hashem, what happened? It says, all humanity spoke Sofa Achas, one language. What was it, Hebrew? So what was that an indication of? What was the essence of all humanity? The essence of humanity was an expression that had relevance to Hashem, the God. As the Ramban says, why is Hebrew called Lashon HaKodesh? Why is it called the Holy Tongue? Because it's the language of Hashem. So if all humanity spoke Lashon HaKodesh, even after the Chet of Adam Rishon, they still had relevance to what he was about. Once they built that Tower of Babel, after the Mabul, this is the continuation of humanity. Hashem says, something? If that's the case, there is no longer any connection between us. That he gave each one a different language, and it was no longer Lashon HaKodesh. Now it's what? Now each of you represents something which has no relevance to that holiness of Hashem in terms of having that relationship. We find the Medrash tells us initially where did Avram come from? Avram Avinu came from Aram Naharaim. He was from Mevar Anor. Actually, Avram did not speak Hebrew. Did not speak Hebrew. We find Noach spoke Lashon HaKodesh. Shem spoke Lashon HaKodesh. But basically it was a forgotten language. Avram Avinu, after he began to espouse monotheism, he became a fugitive. They were hunting him. So it says he went into a cave for 13 years, and when he came out of that cave, he spoke Lashon HaKodesh. And also, Hashem gave him an understanding of the Torah that will eventually be given. What did he spoke Lashon HaKodesh? Because he himself became the representation of Hashem's presence, and he's the founding father of Klal Yisrael. That's Avram Avinu. So that he spoke Lashon HaKodesh was an indication that he himself is a new creation, which he doesn't emanate. We find that the Maharal says, there's a Medrash says, at the time of creation, it says, Bihi Borom, when Hashem created them. So the Medrash says, Bihi Borom, Osios Avram. It's the letters of Avram. You just conjugate the letters differently, it's Avram. Bihi Borom. So the Maharal of Prague explains, Avram, although as a physical being, is a continuation of humanity, but in terms of his level of representation, he was a new creation. Avram Avinu was not part of the original creation. That entity of spirituality he represented, and therefore he could have the relation with Hashem, it didn't exist in existence. It's the equivalent of like an ex nihilo in terms of what he was. This is Bihi Borom, Osis Avram. That's how the Maharal explains this. So as a result of that, Avram Avinu, when he came out of the cave and he proved his dedication and he's willing to die for Hashem and for the sake of monotheism, that's the reason why having a new level of neshama, another capacity, that's the reason why he spoke Hebrew. The Lashon HaKodesh being God's language, which indicates the essence and the profile of the person, that confirmed that he was a spiritual being in a physical body. He was no longer part of humanity. That's the understanding. So what I had said was, we find that Klal Yisrael, why did we merit redemption, despite that they were pagans? So it says for a number of reasons. Lo shinu l'shonam, lo shinu shmam, They did not change their language. They did not change their names. They retained their Hebrew names, Jewish names, and Malbusham, and they retire. What's this whole idea of Loshidu Lashonim? If they themselves would have stopped speaking Hebrew, that was an indication that that spark of Kedusha which they had was totally snuffed out. So that despite being pagans, despite being there the extent of time, and being influenced, if they still could retain the Hebrew language, that's only an indication that there's what to talk about in the future. It could be reactivated. It could be reignited. But if they would have stopped speaking Hebrew, that would have been a confirmation, and they would have spoken Egyptian. That means then the Neshamas no longer had the capacity to have relevance to what Hashem is all about. And because, as we're saying with the Maral, language is a representation of the essence of that nation, of the culture, and therefore then we would have had no relevance to go to Sinai. But because we retained the Lashon HaKodesh Lashonam, therefore that's the reason why we married redemption, because only there was what to talk about in the future.